First, I want to tell you that the series of Bani Israel episodes provoked the history doctors and made them participate in preparing what is coming from it in order to produce the best directing, God willing. Professor Abdullah Maroof, professor of Jerusalem Studies, volunteered, participated and reviewed. Even the previous episode, people volunteered and translated it from English to Russian, and a translation is available for you. God willing, for any other languages, for those who have read, I will tell you the Russian link, God willing, under the video for those who want to do something like it or who want to use it, and I won't tell you more than that. Let's see if we're perfect. Okay, come on. While we stopped at the last episode after the dispersion of the children of Israel in the country, the reprisals that were used against them, the revolutions, and the arrival of some of them in Medina more than 60 years before the mission of the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace. And keep in mind that according to the Jews in the Torah, God came from Teman and the saint from the mountains of Farar al-Marsud. The saint here is the final prophet who will come at the end of time. He will be sent from the Faran region, so their migration to Faran, which is the accusation of stones, originally had a doctrinal background and was not just a random place. It is important that the famous Jewish tribes that we heard in Islamic history were in the city, such as the Banu Kainuka, the Banu Qurayza, the Banu al-Nadir, and even Mrs. Safiya bint Hayyi, who the Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, married her later. She was from the Ibn al-Nadir tribe, and the Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, said to her in the hadith, "Your father is a prophet and your uncle is a prophet and you are under a prophet." Moses, peace be upon him, means Aaron and the Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, and not all the Jews who lived on the island. The Arabs at that time were among the children of Israel because there were Arab Jews who were not originally from the children of Israel, but they converted to Judaism, like the children of Auf, for example. It is also said that the children of Kainuka were Jewish Arabs and that the children of Nadir were mixed. This means that the issue of the pure Arabs who live among us is nothing new, even if the Arab poet Ka'b bin Jordan al-Ashraf was one of the Jews of Banu al-Nadir in Medina, and at that time the Jews of Medina lived in Yathrib, Khaybar, Wadi al-Qura and Taima. At this time, Your Honor, the Muhammadan mission had still begun in Mecca for 3 or 4 years, so the life of the Persian king was broken again with the attack on the Romans in Jerusalem in the year 6 months. And the 14th century AD, and he actually succeeded in expelling the Romans from it, and at that time the Meccan verses were revealed in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, Alif Lamim, the conquerors of the Romans. At that time, Quraysh smelled the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, and his companions, and they said to him, "The people of the idols, with our help, have defeated the people of the book with their help, and this Persian war in which the Jews participated and took revenge with us." The Persians are from the Arab Christians and the Romans, but the Persians also turned against the Jews and expelled them after 3 years. But do not forget that the Quran had predicted in the same verse about the victory of the Romans. Your Lord, glory be to him, said, "And after their defeat, they will be defeated in a few years." The Roman army returned after less than 10 years and achieved victories over the Persians until Heraclius entered with his army and took the entire land in the 16th year of 27 AD, meaning only 10 years after the first Persian victory, and the man defeated them and expelled them. At that time, the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, migrated to Medina. And in fact, as the verse said, "And on that day the believers will rejoice in the victory of God." So they actually rejoiced in the victory of Heraclius over the defeat as stated in it. At that time, a number of events occurred against the Muslims, and the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, defeated the Quraysh in the great battle of Badr, and before that there was another connection for the Muslims with Al-Aqsa Mosque after the verses. Surah Al-Rum is a little bit in the story of the Isra and Mi'raj in Mecca before the Hijrah, the famous story that we all know about the journey of the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, from Mecca to the house of the Avenger and his prayer with the prophets there. Then they ascended to heaven. The greatest connection remains, Your Honor, with directing the Qibla of the Muslims in their prayer when the prayer was made obligatory to Al-Hajj Al-Aqsa. What do you think? All of this happened. The Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, did not clash with the Jews while he was still in Subnida. When the Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, migrated to Medina, they had built a quarry for gold merchants and poor gold merchants, all of them poor, and they had built poor agriculture, and they had built Qurayza, occupying the various industries, and it remained like the same. Weapons manufacturing and other things, meaning the backbone of the city's economy, were in their hands all the time. After the Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him, settled in Medina, one of the first decisions he made was to establish a market for Muslims close to the Prophet's mosque, which would include the remaining immigrants, Ansar, Aus, Khazraj, and everyone else. After the Jews disbelieved in the Prophet, may God's prayers and peace be upon him and his messengers, Just as they disbelieved in Jesus before and in the prophets before, the issue remains for the Jews an economic threat also in the new market for the Muslims' goods after the religious threat of the night journey and the Miraj and the Muslims' Qibla. So Naqa begins with skirmishes similar to revolutions like this against the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, ending with their departure from Medina. The counterpart to the killing of the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, and after that he also ordered them to leave Medina, and after that the famous treachery of Banu Qurayza in the battle of Al-Ahzab, followed by an end to the battle of Khaybar, the elimination of the Jews in Medina and the departure of those who remained of them, and after the death of the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, and after him Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, and then during the reign of Omar ibn al-Khat, here officially was the first era for Muslims to enter the Holy Land, and the Holy House was conquered, and it was the year 66 and 36 AD, and I am after my birth. Keep in mind, it is not Hijri, so that those who follow the chronology with us from the beginning of the first episode will not divorce them. And take note here of an important detail, that Omar ibn al-Khattab, when he came from the city and received the keys of Jerusalem from patriarch Safar Nush and said his famous words to Abu Ubaidah. No, not Abu Ubaidah. Abu Ubaidah means Abu Ubaidah, the great companion Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrar. They said, we are a people whom God has honored with Islam, so no matter what changes. Pride is in others. God has humiliated us, and after receiving, O believer, and entering Jerusalem officially under the command of the Muslims, Omar ibn al-Khattab allowed the Jews and Christians to remain in Jerusalem, and this is in contrast to the disagreement that remained among the people of history. He allowed the Jews to actually reside there and only allowed them to visit. What is important and evidence for us is that the Muslims, when they entered the city of Jerusalem, and there was not a single Jew in it, the virtue of this age-old document, O believer, was in effect throughout the successive periods of the Islamic Caliphate, Abbasid and Ottoman, until recently with the fall of Sultan Abdul Hamid II in the year 1099, because only the educated gentlemen are aware of what you are talking about, and who tells you what we took from. This caliphate was just an occupation, and perhaps they are now happy with the real occupation after the disappearance of protection over the holy sites. They even say that the Al-Aqsa Mosque mentioned in Surah Al-Isra is not the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Palestine, but it was a small mosque like this, is a corner thing. I mean, it's in Taif, close to Egypt. That's why they say that we don't have a call for the special mosque in Palestine. It's not our case. That's why I'm telling you that it's all about the brain. It doesn't even come out of the Zionists themselves, the Jews, Your Excellency, who left the Arabian Peninsula and dispersed in the north. So you have an example. At the time of the Islamic conquest of Iraq in the year 65, it is recorded that there were about 90,000 Jews living here, in addition to those who fled from the Romans in the past, whom we mentioned in the first part. If they thought and fled and went to Europe, what they left would remain in Anadol, which is Turkey now, and Greece and Macedonia, and those who went to Africa. As we said, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and recently Morocco as well. And on the other hand, some of them arrived in Russia in the 7th century, meaning almost the same period in which the remaining people fled to Europe and Africa. So we now have Jerusalem under the rule of the Muslims, and the Christian communities live there practicing their worship, as do the Jews alike. They were small communities living there or whatever. The prophets frequented the place to practice worship also in the episode of the 10 Crusades. We mentioned there that the third crusade was in the year 1191, but when you hear the third, you understand from that there were two other campaigns before it. The first, which was in the year 199, in which they were able to actually occupy Jerusalem from the Muslims, and the second, which was 1147, and which ended at the gates of Damascus and did not arrive. Then we must remain like this for a little while and talk about all the crusades that took place before and after, and those that are coming now until the end. All of them were between Muslims and the Crusaders, and there was no mention of the Jews or the children of Israel in them at all. All the Jews who were in Jerusalem. At the time of the campaign, 70 Jews in number, and the Muslims in this period had been ruling this land for 463 years based on an explicit doctrine and the Sabbath in the Quran and existing sanctities. He left it with two. And as we mentioned in the previous episode, after Jesus, peace be upon him, we have two beliefs, and today we have three beliefs that are fighting over their right to the place, and their name is three beliefs. Take care, but in reality, they are one belief, but the religion with God is Islam, and he did not send all the messengers and prophets, except for monotheism, the doctrine of monotheism, but I am talking about the distortion and change that occurred in previous beliefs, which necessitated the presence of a final prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in order to remind people and return them to what Abraham, peace be upon him, was like. The important thing is that the First Crusade will be victorious in the year 1999, and the Jews will have no sense or information, and Saladin will return and be victorious. There is no sense or news about the Crusaders in the Battle of Hattin in the year 1187, and the Jews also had no idea. Rather, Saladin himself ordered the rebuilding of his Jewish church, but the Crusade destroyed it. They burned them inside there at times, and at that time Saladin allowed them to live in Jerusalem. It was normal. Also, a small glimpse here is that Saladin al-Ayyubi and his teacher Nur al-Din Zengi did not enter to liberate Jerusalem at all, except when they went around it and reached its borders from the outside and cleansed of the Muslims from the north who were protecting this place. The occupation is one of the long-distance countries abroad from the beginning of the Levant, and you have been staying like this until it reached the Fatimids inside Cairo, my dears. What is it? May God protect you from the evil of your people who speak with your tongue, and you also find them beside you praying for dinner. It is their prank with your enemies, and the last of them denounce the condemnation, even if one of their people's blood is protected like this and wants to go to victory. His brothers, they carried out the mission of occupation, arrested him and threw him in prison, and they called him a terrorist too. As for Nur al-Din Zengi and after him Saladin, they spent years fighting the northern Muslims whom you call the countries of the earth, and after they cleansed the earth of them, it was Sur al-Din Zengi died and Saladin entered to purify the land. He remained from the occupiers inside. The important thing, O believer, is that Jerusalem was returned to the Muslims again in the year 1187 at the hands of Saladin in the famous Battle of Hattin, and it remained under the rule of the Muslims from this date until Najba in the year 1948, which we will go to later. From the days of Omar ibn al-Khattab, may God be pleased with him, until the year 48 in Najaba and the Holy House under the command of the Muslims, a removal of them took place, but the 90 years of the First Crusade in which they occupied them, and this of course did not stop the Crusades. So the third arrived in the year 1191, the fourth in the year 122, the fifth remained, the seventh and the eighth sharp ninth, and they read it. About the Children's Campaign, or the Children's Campaign, that emerged from Germany, France, and throughout Europe in the year 1212, which ended with them in the end with a ship sinking and those who were kidnapped by European pirates and followed as slaves in various countries, including countries Arab and Islamic, and we will devote an episode to it one day, God willing, because the story is interesting and sweet, but it is not clear. We return to the children of Israel who lived under the rule of the Islamic Caliphate, whether the minority who were in Jerusalem or in other Muslim countries. They were living normally and were trying to work and practice their worship. Indeed, the Fatimid state was a sample of the Jewish governor among them in the Levant as well, but when they returned, they went to the rest of the countries in which they lived. Britain is the same that supports them today, shoulder to shoulder, and made them wear a travel bag, Your Honor, so that he could consult with them and let them know that the countries of the Jews were in the year 1275, and Edward IX executed hundreds of them and expelled them from all of England in the year 1290. Russia abused them. It ruled them to live in certain areas for a long time and turned the tide on them to the point that Tsar Alexander III fled during his reign from the Jews to Europe and America. About 2 million Jews in the period from 1880 to 1000. 29 years, but even Europe itself could not tolerate marginalization, so Hungary expelled them in the year 1349, and France expelled them several times, the last of them in the year 1592, and Spain and Portugal also expelled them in the year 1492 after the Inquisition, which became notorious even though it was against the Muslims, and they did not say that we would be rid of the Jews at all during the era of Fourth Lib. Italy expelled the Jews in 1567, and Israel expelled them 4 times, the last of which was in 1701. Germany expelled them in 1570. Lithuania and Czechia also expelled them. Even Britain expelled them again more than once. In return, they are in Arab and Muslim countries. Their trade is good in Yemen. Their affairs are good in Morocco. They live in safety and prosperity, and Libyans make good money in Egypt and Iraq and do not have any problems. Focus and see the huge difference between the way Muslims deal with them and with the Crusaders, who have the same issue. Go back to the West and the East and see how they issued them, and we eat with them, and come again to the Caliphate and the Arab countries and the Muslims, and you see the difference in years. The important thing remains, O Lord, that until the First World War, the situation of the Jews was like this in the world, and so until the man who was before your eyes appeared, Your Honor, you are very much the turn of Herzl, and you were born in 2 years, May of the year 1060. The Austro-Hungarian Jewish writer, poet, and political activist. Who made Herzl and who were happy with it? What are the circumstances surrounding the time and place? What is Zionism and what is the difference between it and Judaism? In conclusion, the order of these events remains from 1080 through Hitler and the migration of Jews to Palestine, and after that, the Nakba and setback until today in 2023 will happen, God willing, in the final episode of the Children of Israel series next Thursday.